Laramie, Wyoming, a place that will be our home for the next 4 years. A city that is full of diversity, business, and home to the only university in the state of Wyoming. But what built this city, and why was Laramie chosen to be home of the Pokes? After doing extensive research on the city of Laramie and the university, it is easy to understand why Laramie was founded and how it has become what it is today. Today I would like to talk about the history of Laramie, the resources found here, and tell you a little bit more about some buildings in our university. So let's begin by taking a look at Laramie's history. Laramie was first called Laramie City, and that name was established by General Granville Dodge. He was the man in charge of planning the Union Pacific's route westward. The city of Laramie, as well as many other places in eastern Wyoming, are named after a French-Canadian trapper named Jacques Laramie, who was killed in the mountains by Indians. Laramie began as a tent town as the Union Pacific Railroad built tracks across the plains in pursuit of a connection with the Central Pacific Railroad coming from California. These tent towns were very simple and only had the necessities for the railroad workers and the western adventurers. Since Laramie was always being of service to the rail workers, Laramie was an area full of gambling establishments, saloons, hotels, and houses of ill repute. According to the Laramie Area Chamber of Commerce 2009 magazine, the main reasons for the existence of Laramie for many years was the presence of the railroad and the operations it established. This included a roundhouse, an iron foundry, a tie treating plant, machine shops, and a mill for reprocessing old rails. But just as easy as these small towns sprang up, it was that easy for them to die out. According to a book published by the Laramie Plains Museum in 2007, there were two critical elements that were necessary for a town to make it: entrepreneurial ventures and cultural development. Mr. and Mrs. Edward Ivinson contributed both to the town of Laramie so it would grow and flourish. Next, we can take a look into the Ivinson family and their historic home in the Laramie community. Ivinson Mansion was built in 1892 by Edward and Jane Ivinson, who were one of Laramie's most notable pioneer couples. Edward had the business sense and vision that helped jumpstart Laramie's economy. According to the Laramie Plains Museum, Edward had his mercantile. He served the railroad and the new families and businesses that were taking root in the area. Not only did Mr. Ivinson provide services for the people of Laramie, but he also invested in the area and grew his fortune. He had the foresight to lay claim to a large portion of Boulder Ridge, which is located south of town and is heavily wooded. Since the Union Pacific needed timber for the tracks that were being laid, Edward became an astute broker with the railroad. Ivinson's fortune was supported greatly by those contracting endeavors. Edward Ivinson became one of the town and state's earliest bankers. Jane Ivinson, on the other hand, invested time and effort in the township's cultural development. Jane set up the first Sunday school on the crates in the back of her husband's mercantile and contacted the nearest diocese for Laramie City to be placed on the circuit for a traveling preacher. She and other women joined forces to raise funds for the first school, and would always be part of planning socials, dances, and anything that would benefit the growing town. Edward and Jane built Ivinson Mansion 24 years after their arrival on the first train into Laramie City. In the book by the Laramie Plains Museum, the house was a culmination of their hard work and savvy vision for the adolescent town. This house was made of native stone and wood and cost close to $25,000 to build. And with additions to the home and all the necessary furnishings, it would eventually reach a $40,000 net worth, an incredible sum in the last decade of the 19th century. This house had electricity, forced air heating, running water, and the latest in modern commodities. Mr. and Mrs. Ivinson were known for their lavish gatherings at their home and around the community. They lived in the house happily and had a family. Later, Jane passed away in 1921, but Edward and the rest of the family continued to live there. It was in 1921 that Mr. Ivinson gave the house to the Episcopal Missionary District, and it became a girls' boarding school. This home had a fascinating history as a gracious home of one of Laramie's finest families, as a successful and influential school for girls, and as a boarding house for university professors and families. Since 1972, it has been home to the Laramie Plains Museum and will continue to be one of Laramie's greatest treasures. Now that we have discussed the history of Laramie, let's move on to some of the major resources. In a book titled The City of Laramie and Its Resources, issued by the Board of Trade in 1890, Laramie is known as the Gem City of the Rockies. The railroad was one of Laramie's greatest assets. Laramie is one of the largest towns on the Union Pacific Railroad and was full of extensive machine and repair shops, which became sources of perpetual trade and income. Other resources that Laramie is rich in are natural resources such as coal, stone quarries, lime, timber, and even the soil here. Laramie also had a large iron foundry and glass factory. But what has become the greatest resource in Laramie has become the University of Wyoming. According to the University of Wyoming webpage, the University of Wyoming was founded in 1886, when Wyoming was still a territory. In September of 1887, UW opened its doors to 42 students and 5 faculty members. Since Wyoming was the equality state, both the students and faculty included women from the very first day. Built on the outskirts of town in Laramie City Park, Old Main was UW's first building that held classes, the library, and administrative offices during the first years of the university's existence. Now let's take a look at other different buildings on campus, and let me tell you a little bit about their history. Ross Hall was constructed in 1959 and opened as a women's dormitory in 1960. Since 1976, Ross Hall has housed academic offices for a number of departments. This building was named for the nation's first woman governor, Nellie Taylor Ross, who was elected governor of Wyoming in 1924. There is a brass plaque between the elevators on the ground floor of Ross Hall commemorating Nellie Taylor Ross for her job well done. Only 2 other campus buildings were named after Wyoming governors, but those 2 are recognized for being university presidents, not just for being governor. Next is Knight Hall, which is named after Emma Howell Knight and the mother of a famed geology professor named Samuel Knight. Mrs. Knight served as a dean of women from 1911 to 1921. This building's core was completed in 1941, and the western wing was added 5 years later. This building served as dorms until 1972, first for women, and in the 60s it was for graduate men. It was later converted into offices in 1972. Moving on is the Cheney International Center in Student Health. This building was built at the same time as Ross Hall in 1960, and it served as a school of nursing until 2005, when the program was moved to the Health Sciences Building. This building used to be for military drills. Since Dick and Lynn Cheney Plaza is in front of the building, the name was given to the building as well. It is named for Vice President Dick Cheney, who was Vice President from 2001 to 2009, and his wife Lynn, who was an author who was a chairwoman for the National Endowment for the Humanities from 1986 to 1993. Next, we have the Avon Nelson building, which was built in 1924 to house the University Library, and the top east floor was the first permanent home for the UW College of Law, which was formed in 1920. The building itself is named for one of the 5 original faculty at UW, a man who became nationally renowned for his field of botany and spent several years as a university president before stepping aside just as this building was completed. Avon Nelson is the subject of books by UW professors Roger Williams and Frida Knockbloch. Next, we have Half Acre Gym, which was built in 1925 from some oil royalties earned on a university-owned land. This gym replaced the little gym that was located behind Old Main. A state-of-the-art facility for its time, the building was home for the UW basketball team of 1943 that won the NCAA National Championship. The rear facade of the building was removed in 2013 and replaced with a $25 million addition that nearly triples the size of the building and provides increased space for academics, intramural and club sports, and physical fitness. Lastly, we have the Student Union Building, which was authorized by the legislature in 1937 and was built in 1939. Initially, students and faculty had to pay a fee to use the union. Members had to show cards before gaining entrance to the building. Additions in 1979 and 2002 completely changed the internal layout of the building. Enhanced spaces were provided for the UW bookstore, food service, a copy center, banking and credit union offices, student government, and various clubs, as well as a number of student lounges. Now that we have discussed the history of Laramie, resources found here, and telling you a little bit more about our campus history, let's recap. Our campus is huge, and Laramie is rich in history and interesting topics. And as much as I would love to keep talking and keep telling you more and more about our campus and our town, our class time is limited. Today we talked about the history of Laramie, important resources of Laramie, and a little bit more about our university. I hope everyone here has learned something after watching this video. Thank you, Josh, for the assignment, and hope everybody enjoyed. Lastly, go Pokes!